really decreasing. And I think Bill talked about the number of U.S. college players in the NHL now and how that has grown. Well, today's presentation, I've got two top-notch speakers from the Hamilton Dundas area here, Paul and Lisa. They're going to talk a little bit about the, you can see here is the changing geographics or demographic or geographics. Where do NHL players come from now? I'll turn it over to these two.
Sure, okay. So my name is Peter. This is Lisa. I work for Stats Canada at McMaster University in a research data center. We have tons of data. And Lisa is one of the researchers from sociology, so she comes in. We don't have hockey database data, but we both enjoy sports and hockey, so we had the idea of thinking about where NHL players are coming from a geography point of view, is related to sociology and community and this kind of thing. So we got together about this time last year, and it took us a year to do this project. So the title is, It's Cold and There's Something to Do. You know, you've heard the axiom, it's cold and there's nothing to do. The changing geography of Canadian NHL league players' hometowns. So, background and objectives. So, we're interested in this concept of geography. We know that there's lots of changes going on in the NHL and in the sports world. And we based our work on the seminal work of Curtis and Birch in 1987 when they looked at the birthplace effect of making it to the NHL, and they were the first authors to quantitatively examine community size and sports expertise. For professional players, we think the formative years of their development are perhaps, and you know, I use the word perhaps, between the ages of 10 and 19, when the influence of parents, coaches, volunteers, and community facilities, example arenas, is crucial. Being in Parry Sound is a perfect example of, I think, what we all are observing this weekend. We focus on the hometown of a player rather than his birthplace. So we do a little bit of a shift in the research, and we're interested more in where they grew up rather than where they were born. That presented us with a huge verification challenge, which I'll explain in a minute. In essence, we're interested in the role that community plays in developing elite athletes in their youth. But if you were to ask me, I think Lisa would agree, we're not just interested in analytics or elite athletes or those stars that make it to the NHL. I think that what we're interested in more is a narrative that is wider than just the elite athletes and related to the systems of support that communities of all sizes can offer young people. So we know that Bobby Orr, of course, came from Parry Sound. He had a network of support, but there are many others in the arts and recreation and science that may benefit from certain community sizes and support from their families that allow them to prosper. So that's the context. We're not just interested, our paper is about elite athletes, but we're interested in that wider concept of community. Okay, so what did we do to start off? So, went to the hockey database. All of you are familiar with that, pretty good data space. Was used to create a data file consisting of every person who played at least one game in the NHL between 1970 and 2015, over a 46-year period. We're not interested in analytics. We think that anybody that plays at least one game in the NHL is an elite athlete and has achieved something very significant in their lives. They may go on to play in another professional league under Europe. So our file, and I know numbers may differ, of course, we agree, but our file came up with 5,637 players over the 46-year period. And we divided the study period into time blocks because we wanted to adjust for community size and population. Our 5 time blocks are the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, 2000 to 2009, and then one 6-year period from 2010 to 2015. And what we did is, because we're kind of nerdy, Statistics Canada, people who like data, we employed census data from a number of census, 76, 86, 96, 2000, to adjust the geographic classification of places, because of course some towns will shrink, others will grow. There's a whole, so we want to make sure that when we do this analysis that we're adjusting according to the appropriate population size, right? And to calculate provincial and territorial rates of NHL players per 1,000 males aged 8, 10 to 19. A place like Parry Sound, they may have had a very different number of youth or kids in the 1970s as per today. So if we're going to look at the impact, we've got to adjust for the population size, which I think makes sense. Okay, hometown verification. We started this project last April or May or something, and this was the most grueling aspect of our research, I think, Lisa, was what we call verification. So we attempted to establish a player's hometown in the select years prior to him being recruited or drafted into junior or college programs. So we had the database. We had our 5,600 players. We extracted mostly the Canadian players, but we also looked at US players and European players, and we wanted to verify the difference between birthplace and hometown. Went to a number of sites, of course, the SIHR database, where the people that have been updating us, Ernie and others, have been great in updating when the birthplace differs from the hometown, right? So there's lots of examples there. We looked at Hockey Draft Central, another good data site that lists the hometown of a player. Went to the official site of the Hockey Hall of Fame. Another is the Legends of Hockey. Very good source for also trying to estimate or verify hometown. We looked at some Wikipedia entries, and where available, we looked at media team guides that are online, but not everything's online depending on the vintage. So we did an exhaustive verification period for all players, and our search resulted in a total of 603 edits. So that's 11% of all entries to the birthplace record to record hometown of player. And we created a final data set consisting of 3,469 players with Canadian hometowns, regardless of where they were born. There's a large number of players. We could go on some examples. Owen Nolan was born in Belfast but grew up in Thorold, Ontario. Steve Yzerman, Cranbrook, but grew up in Nepean. Peter Lee, you remember from Ottawa 67 star, grew up in Chester, United Kingdom, born in Chester but grew up in Arvida, Quebec. Jim Pack from Seoul, South Korea, grew up in Toronto. And Olaf Kolzig, who was born in Johannesburg but grew up in Union Bay, BC. So that was just an example of some of the 603 edits that we used to establish hometown. Okay, geographic classification. We're interested in grouping our list of Canadian players according to the size of the community, and we had a number of communities. So this is a Stats Canada classification of places that they've been using since the early 1970s. So Class 1 is the largest, Class 2, Class 3 is medium center. Small centers are considered to have a population between 1,000 to 30,000, and Class 5 is rural to remote, less than 1,000 residents. So what we did then is we went back to our data set, and as we moved forward in those 5 time blocks, we adjusted to the changing size of the community. For example, Milton, Ontario was very different in the 1970s than it is today, right? And places like Charlottetown and Kelowna and Lethbridge all moved up. Many of them moved up in the classification. So when we're going to talk about where the hometown is, we can't use a 1970s definition of Milton. Well, Milton is probably where? Somewhere in here? Class 2 maybe? So we adjusted for that over time. So you have a good representation of what's happening over a period of time. We also looked at distance to a big city, and this is where Lisa will talk about a couple of surprising developments. So we had, for classes 4 and 5, for the small and rural and remote communities, we had a proximity to a large urban area. So if this community was within 100 kilometers or 1 hour drive, it was coded as one being in proximity. But if one of these smaller communities was more than 100 kilometers or more than an hour's drive, then it was considered to be not in proximity. So we're interested in this classification over time, but also the distance to a big city. Does that have an impact on a player's likelihood of making it to the NHL? Okay, let's get to the results. The shifting geography of NHL players' hometowns. I'm going to talk about one slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, who's going to talk more specifically about some of the trends in in Canada. Some of our bars here were a little bit not showing up as well. But here basically, I think this is a slide that all of us in the room are probably already familiar with. And what it's showing is you can see several time periods, here's the 5 time blocks, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, 2000, and then 2000 to 2015. We can see that we have 4 regions of players from Canada, from the US, from Europe, and other. 2 of our bars are not showing up for whatever reason, but I'll just paraphrase. Here we see in the NHL in the 1970s, 84% of the players were from Canadian hometowns. But as we move over to our final period in 2000 to 2015, we came up with a number just 47% of players. So you can see a market decline in Canadian players' hometowns. But what we see, and our graph didn't turn out, is really 2 things. Growth of European players over the time, coinciding really in the late 80s, early 90s with the breakup of the Soviet Union, which released dozens and dozens of elite former Soviet bloc players. But also, it's a little bit hard to see, our graph didn't turn out, but we see the ascendancy of USA hockey, really. And we talked about that a couple of times earlier in the day. So those are some of the overall kind of global trends, which then set the context for what's going on within Canada. So I'll just turn it over to Lisa, who's going to talk about the rest.
Well, thanks, Peter. Okay. Oh, nice to meet you, everyone. So my name is Lisa Qaida. I'm an assistant professor in sociology at McMaster University. And by training, I am a sociologist specializing in immigrant integration as well as labor market with no specific link to hockey in general. But for the past few years, my partner, who is actually sitting over there, Professor Harry Kunduri, who is a mathematician, but also he grew up in Northern Ontario. And as he grew up, he was exposed to hockey. And also when he was at the University of Cambridge, he played ice hockey for the ice hockey team in the University of Cambridge. And on Canada Day, his team played against University of Oxford. So I am with a guy who has so much ties with Canadian hockey. And for the past few years, I learned quite a lot about how important hockey is to the Canadian society. And as a result, I am increasingly interested in a sort of community, a Canadian community, and its ties to Canadian hockey. So that's part of the reason why Peter and I are really kind of getting along well and academically interested in hockey. So now let's get to the main point of our findings. So as Peter said, now we're going to focus specifically on what's happening to those Canadian-grown hockey players. So this bar, although there are a bit of technical glitches, but what we're trying to show here is that sort of a stable regional distribution of Canadian-raised NHL players when it comes to which part of Canada they are coming from. And just to explain what is exactly going on in this each bar, so like Peter said, we try to look at the trends in the regional distribution from 1970 to 2015. So for example, if you take this far left bar, what we are trying to see is that what percentage of Canadian-born players are coming from specific region of Canada, starting with BC as well as Territory, 7%, and 25% came from the Prairie provinces, including Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and unfortunately the missing part is the Ontario. Back in 1970 and 79, 47% of the Canadian-born players grew up in Ontario. And moving on, 16% of Canadian-grown players grew up in Quebec, and finally the rest, 4% of the players grew up in Atlantic Canadian provinces, including Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, and Newfoundland. And what's happening, what's interesting from this slide is that even though the presence of Canadian-grown players is sort of declining over years, the regional distribution sort of is stabling over time. What's happening is that the Ontario is still maintains to be a major source of Canadian-grown players. like back in 1979, 79, like I said, 47% of those players grew up in Ontario, and this trend kind of stayed the same even up until 2010 to 2015. The latest statistics shows a similar to the earlier trend. Again, 46% of the Canadian-born players who started playing in the NHL between 2010 and 2015 actually grew up in Ontario. And another stable, interesting trend that we found is the sort of strong presence of prairie-grown players, despite the fact that the population of those prairie provinces is relatively small compared to other major provinces like Ontario and Quebec. So overall, almost one-third, just less by one-third of the Canadian-born players grew up in 3 provinces of prairie: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. So in addition to looking at this regional distribution of Canadian-born players, we also try to look at the distribution of Canadian players by how big or how small their hometown is. So this is a sort of geographic distribution of Canadian-raised NHL players by the population size of the of their hometown. Like Peter explained earlier, we use this very common Statistics Canada's classification of how big or how small your town is, including rural, remote, which is the smallest category, less than 1,000 people in that area, followed by small center, which has the population of 1,000 to 30,000 people, followed by medium center. Unfortunately, the medium centers part didn't show up, but I'm going to try to explain later.
Yeah, they show up on our screen on the computer, but for some reason with the projection, the color coding today for some reason doesn't show up. Don't know, maybe it's because of the gray that we selected or something. Yeah. So, you know, you can all crowd around the computer.
And then the fourth category is large urban area, which has the population of 100,000 to 500,000. And finally, the green bar, largest urban area, stands for the big city with the population of 500 and more. And what this bar chart shows is that the share of so-called large urban players is slowly but steadily increasing over the past 46 years. So that's what we say, that's what we call it a steady rise of urban players, referring to these large urban areas with the population of 500,000 people over, and these large urban areas with the population between 500,000 and 100,000 to 500,000. So what's happening is back in 1970s, less than 50%, or more specifically 44% of the Canadian-born players grew up in those so-called big cities. But by and then this proportion started to grow over time, slowly but steadily. And by 2010 and 2015, almost 6 out of 10 Canadian-grown players grew up in so-called large urban and largest urban areas. And in particular, this is something we didn't explain on our slide, but our data analysis shows that the 3 largest Canadian cities, namely Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, or what sociologists, geeks like us often call MTV areas, represented the hometown of 35% of the Canadian-born players who started playing in the NHL between this 2010 and 2015, like most like a recent era, including people, big players like Connor McDavid. And also at the same time, we're also seeing the so-called the recent decline of small town players. Up until 2009, we witnessed a sort of a stable and stronghold of so-called like small town players, including those who grew up in rural, remote areas, very small town, as well as the small centers, places like Trail, BC, or Weyburn, Saskatchewan, or Temiskaming, Quebec. And that kind of small town players used to comprise up to 1/3 of the Canadian-born players up until 2009. But then this share of small town players started to decline all of a sudden since 2010 and 2015. So the latest statistics show that Oregon players grew up in so-called small town with the population of less than 30,000 people. And this is sort of the this is the kind of the NHL players that we're interested in. So then in the next in the next few slides, we're just going to focus on so-called small town players who grew up in either who grew up. Oh, okay, this is the small town. Yeah, so who grew up in either rural, remote area with the population of 1,000 people, or the small center with the population of between 1,000 and 30,000 people. And since in those small towns, like traveling may be constituting like an integral part of those youth hockey players, like skills development, taking buses, trying to go to larger cities, and trying to play against the opponent teams. So then we try to see how the relationship between their hometown, this small hometown, and the nearest like urban area like Toronto or maybe Winnipeg or Saskatoon and so forth. And what this graph shows is that the first two graphs, the first two bars for each time period stands for the percentage of like small center players whose hometown is really like, in remote area, whose hometown is 100 kilometers, more than 100 kilometers farther than the nearest urban city, versus the small center players whose hometown is pretty much like, relatively close to the nearest like urban areas, like a 1 hour driving. And what this bar shows is so-called small town players distance advantage, meaning that quite the majority of so-called small town players are like growing up in a really remote area, which would take more than 1 hour of driving to get to the like a nearby town. So up until I would say 2009, those more than 60% of so-called small center players grew up in very remote area that requires lots of traveling, probably using buses, maybe trains or plane and so forth. And the same trend was happening among players who grew up in rural and remote area with the population less than 1,000 people. Unfortunately, the bar that shows such very peculiar players didn't show up. But what these numbers are meant to show the really high bar of those rural players who are living in such remote areas. So what was happening is up until 2009, almost 80% of such rural remote players grew up in the very, very remote area, which that is 100 kilometers, more than 100 kilometers farther than the urban areas. So from this bar chart, what we want to emphasize is that those small town players are sort of having a distant advantage, meaning that they sort of overcame the disadvantage of living in remote areas, and maybe with all those support that they get from the local communities, school teachers, local fans, or local small shop owners who maybe fund some games. And by taking that advantage, they were able to make it to the NHL. But that kind of small disadvantage is waning, is starting to diminish in the past 5 years. If you take a look at the differences, all of a sudden a change in this trend, in the sense that more and more small town players are coming from relatively urban areas, which gives them easier access to urban areas to get some more systematic training system in the urban areas like Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver, maybe Ottawa, and so forth. So finally, we're going to look at the small town advantage in specific provinces. So what we did was we tried to calculate the number of NHL players per 1,000 male who are the age between 10 and 19 by the size of the hometown from 1970 to 2015. So not just the percentage of the players who are coming from specific regions. Now we try to calculate how likely it is for a boy in a specific like a town, specific size of the community to make it to the NHL. And for the sake of time, we're only focusing on Canadian-born players who grew up in Ontario, which produces the largest number of NHL players, as well as the Saskatchewan, who tends to produce NHL players more likely despite its relatively small population. And from this slide, our main findings about Ontario results are twofold. So first, a growing number of Ontario-raised players are coming from the suburbs of large urban areas like Toronto, but the number of NHL players per 1,000 male youth from those big cities is quite low, meaning that it's extremely difficult for those big city Ontario kids to make it to the NHL from their neighborhoods. And as we see here, in large urban areas of Ontario, the number of NHL players per 1,000 male is extremely low, like below one person. And by contrast, actually, growing up in medium centers, like a medium-sized city, gives them a more advantage of making it to the NHL, especially in the earlier period of 1970s and 1980s. The number of Ontario-grown NHL players per 1,000 male, it was like relatively high. And we tried to go back to the data to see which cities we're talking about back in the 1970s and 1980s in terms of this medium center. And what we found is the places like Ottawa or Thunder Bay were part of these statistics, meaning that boys who are growing up in Ottawa and Thunder Bay, which used to be considered as medium center cities, were more likely to be making it to the NHL. And finally, we're going to focus on so-called like a small town advantage, especially with a focus on Saskatchewan-grown players. And what's fascinating about Saskatchewan is that compared to these Ontario results, the number of NHL players per 1,000 male youth is like relatively high. As these numbers, you're more likely to see 2 players per 1,000 males as opposed to 1 player or 0.5 players and so forth. And especially growing up in smaller centers as well as medium centers, sort of medium-sized cities, gives them an advantage of making it to the NHL. So examples like Swift Current or Meadow Lake, they are sort of seen as major producers of NHL players coming from Saskatchewan, the province of Saskatchewan. And we're only crunching numbers, so we haven't. It's not like we interviewed those players who came from Swift Current or Meadow Lake and so forth. But what we're guessing, based on the existing academic research or existing books on hockey, is that those players, small town players, may have had like strong communities commitment, like dedicated coaches or school teachers, volunteers, or local fans that may have been helping those Saskatchewan small town youth to succeed in elite hockey. But similar to what we have been finding so far in other previous slides, that kind of small town advantage in Saskatchewan may be declining in more recent years, if you look at 2010, 2015 results, the number of the number of NHL players who made it to the NHL during that period from those small centers is starting to be diminished in terms of their per 1,000 male youths. So in our paper, we have lots more other findings using more fancy statistics, but to sort of the take-home message of our presentation is that even though the share of Canadian-grown players is declining for the past 46 years, but we still see some stable trends between 1970s to 2009, including this stable provincial distribution. We see strong presence of Ontario-grown players as well as Prairie province players. And also up until 2009, we see the advantage of growing up in smaller towns, including small centers as well as rural remote areas. But that kind of good old days stable trend starting to be changing after 2010. So the interesting changes that we're finding are, first, the rise of so-called large urban players, especially the suburbs of big cities like Toronto and Vancouver, as well as Montreal area. And the decline of small town advantage, as we saw earlier. So then, in terms of how we are interpreting this data analysis, well, we're speculating the so-called polarization of the path to elite hockey, namely NHL when it comes to Canada. So even though we are seeing more and more youth players who are growing up in so-called big cities, but given the fact that the number of NHL players per 1,000 youth in those regions is very small, then what we are speculating is that those big city youth players may be getting lost in the youth hockey system. With some of the kids who have very savvy parents who know all those hockey training system, or some of the kids whose parents are well networked, young maybe professionals who are well networked in the local system, may be able to navigate through the system, hockey system, well in such privatized sort of a hockey system, training youth hockey system in the big cities. But then the flip side of this argument is that children who are talented yet who are not too familiar, whose parents may not be familiar with that kind of privatized system, may be get lost in the system, and as they grow up, they may be dropping out of the youth hockey system. And another, the other side of this polarization of the path to elite hockey that we are speculating is the so-called the decline of small-town youth hockey players. And given the fact that our latest statistics show that the so-called small-town advantage is diminishing, that may have something to do with the economic declining or so-called deindustrialization of small towns. Then those former sort of steel town or like mining cities that used to have lots of corporate support to nurture hockey players, that kind of community support may be waning, and then that could be leading to the more growing disadvantage of small town hockey players. And that's sort of still, this is sort of our like a speculative level, and we will, during our Q&A period, we will appreciate any sort of qualitative evidence or sort of anecdotal evidence that could be helpful for our paper. Currently, our paper is under review for the International Review of Sociology of Sports, and in order for us to further improve our paper, we will really appreciate your feedback. Well, thanks for your attention, and we'll open up the floor to get some questions. Thank you.
Okay, you used several sources. You listed the sources that you use.
Well, one main source, but
What was the main one?
Hockey DB.
Pardon?
Hockey database.
Oh, that was the main one.
And then the other sources were for verification only.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a two-way.
So did you factor in a percentage error? Because if there's 5 or 6 different databases, you could have 6 different places of birth. How did you handle that? There's so many, what I'm saying is there's so many mistakes. What did you, I guess you took the hockey DB as the gospel, right?
Yes, and then worked from there, and then made our 603 edits based on our other 4 or 5 sources that we did the verification. So, but that's where we could find evidence of a difference between the birthplace and the hometown through an exhaustive search. So we were at 11% of our total database, 603 edits that we made. But we needed to find good evidence of a change between birthplace and hometown. We need to verify that in a couple of sources.
So did you in fact find variety in terms of players' birthplace across the database as you looked at it, or was there generally consistency?
Generally consistent, yeah. Generally, yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you noticed a decline in the number of players coming from smaller communities. Is there also a corresponding decline in the number of small communities? There are people becoming more growth in the urban centers and declining.
Perfect question. I'll let Lisa.
That's taken care of in our small town. The number of NHL player per 100 male youth. So this sort of adjusts for such like a decline in rural areas. There is an interesting statistics kind of report on the urbanization of Canada.
But is that declining number then just a function of there being the smaller communities are getting smaller, and therefore the interest and the
and then
the resources put into it.
But we also we adjusted our population according to census changes, so we did 2 things. I think that both are going on at the same time. Yeah.
The standard in Census Canada used to be, and I'm not sure if it still is, that an urban center was a town of, I think, of 2,000 people, and that skewed a lot of their data because a town of 2,000 people is not urban. It doesn't have all the things that you'd expect in an urban center. So I was sort of wondering whether you were using that as your base point. And the other question was, do you have any analysis of demographics? Because obviously the influx of immigrants into Canada over the last 20, 30 years might show either a predominance of people who are, like 2nd or 3rd generation Canadians playing hockey versus 1st generation Canadians who would probably be playing other sports.
Yeah, Lisa.
So for the rural and urban categorization, my understanding is that 1,000 people in the neighborhood is a threshold. But that's something.
1,000.
1,000.
Yeah, I find that hard to believe because I live in a village that's got 1,000 people, and it's certainly not urban.
And that's the.
And the reverse is true, that there are a lot of small communities that have now grown into larger communities, which are much
but then we have to back up a second. So we do have the census metropolitan area, right? So a CMA. So you may have a small town that's within the CMA, but it's considered to be urban, right? So it depends on where you are. It's a distance factor that you have to count into the stats can. And then I think the second question is we adjusted the youth population as it changed over the periods. So a place like Parry Sound, probably in the 1970s, had maybe twice as many male youth between, but we adjusted our rates according to changes in the census to make a fair comparison.
Right. But the second question about demographics,
yeah.
Into that.
Do you think
I know that's sort of hard to plot, but it is, I think, a trend, and that's one of the things that that there are more participation, more individual participation sports that people from other countries are involved in, or team participation sports that are not hockey.
Yeah. Probably require a secondary paper where we go to places like Brampton, Mississauga, and see how the changing registrations. But may not be all bad news. We may see some good stories there. Immigrant families wanting the kids to get involved in Canadian culture. So it's a fascinating question. I think we need a secondary follow-up and go in and actually talk to parents. We're data nerds, but now we got to go and talk to parents. Yeah.
The last meeting you presented on how there was a change in how youth are playing sports in Canada. So you actually showed a change that there was
Yeah,
less
you
people.
remember last year, yeah.
Yeah, you were showing that there was less
Yeah.
people playing hockey and they
Yeah.
were moving towards soccer and
That's
some
right.
of the other ones.
I
Well,
think-
maybe that's, you already got the paper.
Yeah. But you know what, Ed, your memory's better than mine. I can't even remember my slides from last year.
And actually, as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, yeah, I do lots of research on how immigrants and their children incorporate into Canada, like socially and economically. So yeah, like Peter and I are talking about the participation in hockey versus soccer among the born in Canada with parents. So that's sort of the whole demographic change is part of our interest.
When?
Yes, you said that initially there would be 5,300 players that were recorded as having played in that period, and then you whittle it down to 3,500, essentially, that you are looking at. What happened to the other 1,800 and how come they're not included?
Well, because we're focusing on Canada, hometowns in Canada. So those are all international players. So the Europeans and the Americans, and we tried to look at that movement, like other world region players who were born in other world regions grew up in Canada, Americans who grew up in Canada, and the flip side, we've got more Canadian kids are born in Canada, maybe because their parents play professional hockey, end up growing up in the US. So it was a big movement there in that to whittle it down to the 3,500. Yes, JP.
Did you look at all in the issue of climate with global warming? There's fewer and fewer places where you can play.
So that's, you know what, a great points there. I think climate change may be, you know, a big factor, right, Lisa?
No, that's true. And there, I remember there is an interesting New York Times article about the decline of sort of an outdoor hockey rink in Canada. So yeah, that would be an interesting point to, like a factor to look at. But in our specific research, we didn't take that kind of like environmental factors into account.
In fact, one phenomenon is that they're starting to build outdoor rinks with artificial ice. Or for freezing system that we used to order so that the ice doesn't melt all the time.
Bill, do I have a minute?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Our very last slide we talked about, and I just want your opinion, many of your parents are involved in the community, where we speculated about kids in big city programs, quote unquote, getting lost. Are you in line? Kevin's shaking his head no. Yeah. I mean, but
if a kid's good, he's going to be found.
No, but I mean the politics. Like I'm an hockey outsider, but I play recreational hockey 80 times a year, and I don't talk a lot, but I listen to parents who have kids, and you hear a lot about, you know, the infighting, the politics, and they say my kid is no longer interested, Kevin. That's what I'm wondering. Because I don't know. I'm relying on you.
Well, my son plays in the Oakville system. I grew up in Oakville. I played in the Oakville system. Right now, if my son's 11 years old. He's in his age group. They have 3 divisions of house league with 6 teams in each division, plus 6 rec teams.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be particularly good. You have to be in the top quartile to make rec now. That's not what it was when I was growing up. You have to be good to play rec when I was growing up. Now you just have to be in the top 25%. The kids get a lot more training now. If you want your kid to be rec, there's people who move around, and Oakville has experienced, the really elite players in Oakville are going to the GTHL, right? So the Oakville Hockey Association is rebranding itself and trying to get better coaching in to try and keep those players in Oakville.
Okay.
But if you want your kid to play hockey, you can have them on the ice 7 days a week through all of the different hockey schools. We have 2 private companies in Oakville that have small rinks where they're sort of 150 by 50 foot rinks in industrial buildings that they've built, and they have hockey schools in there that are run by former OHL players. So you can have your kid on private sessions on the ice. So I think a lot of this growth in urban centers is accessibility to ice and coaching, right? Whereas in the 70s, the farmer kids were all out playing in the fields in the winter because there was no farming to do, so they were out skating on outdoor ice. Now the kids in the urban centers are getting as many days a week coaching as you want to give them.
Great insight, thanks. Any other questions? Yeah, come right here. and
Oh, I
then-
know Phil, you can afford it.
Well, I think, and I'm making this up, but
Yeah.
I think this is true in every sport where parents have aspirations for their children to play at elite level, and the kid gets to be 15, 16, and they may not be achieving their dream, or it's the parent's dream.
Yeah.
And when the kids get old enough, and what I always used to joke was, for boys, they'd get a girlfriend, a car, and a part-time job, and they're done. Because it was their parents' dream. And I grew up with figure skating, I grew up with tennis, and hockey wasn't as big a deal when I was a kid in Cleveland, Ohio. But I think there's a huge burnout factor.
Yeah.
Where if you have a kid on the ice 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and it's your dream, at some point, some kids decide, I'm done. How many that is, I couldn't tell
Do
you.
you have them all, Bill, or are we pressed for time?
I'm going to ask a question.
Oh, yeah, sure.
My observation, having been in youth hockey, is that a lot of this difference is how much money the parents are willing to pay.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so really you start looking at, you have a player, but as Kevin points out, you can have the player and you're willing to support their rec team or travel team, whereas you can have a good player, in theory, a good player, but his parents can't afford, his or her parents can't afford to get all of the additional training, so they may
And there are a handful of players as well that are rec caliber that are playing house league just because they don't want to get bothered
Yes.
with the
Yes.
politics.
Yes.
There's a couple of kids in my son's league that just blow everybody away.
Yeah.
And they're clearly rec caliber players, but they don't want to play rec.
Exactly, I think that's what we're trying to
Yeah.
get at.
Yes.
But up to
So I
that,
don't think they're lost in the system. I just think.
well, maybe lost, not the right word, but somewhat frustrated.
Yeah,
How's that?
because, I mean, the rep coaches are after these kids every
Yeah.
year. Do you want to try out for rep? Do you want to try out for rep? Oh, you can't, your parents can't get you to the games? I'll take you to the games.
So that's fine. So what were places like Humboldt and Estevan and Moose Jaw doing so well up to about 2009 or 10? Small towns with one rink like this, but
Yeah.
amazing success.
Well, I think there's more of the, just out on your own, developing your own skills and having that sort of creativity that's lost in the kids. That now all the kids can play perfect systems by the time they're 11 years old.
And the cost to the family may be much less because the ice is cheaper.
Yeah.
We talk about the quantitative issues, but the qualitative matters is also a factor.
Yeah.
I lived in Switzerland for 5 years, and the coaching there was phenomenal.
Yeah.
And there were only 20 kids playing in each rink in Geneva, a town of 400,000 people, at each level. And it was pretty well the same right across Switzerland, population 7 million. Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, same sort of thing. Very, very few players, but very high quality. The coaching was superb. What they did, each rink did, was they hired a professional with a master's in sport, and that professional was responsible for coaching the kids from 5 years old. My son went in 3.5, but from 5 years old all the way up to the junior team, and he taught, or he trained the parents who helped. Like, he was always on the ice with every single level of kid and coached the junior team.
Wow.
And they had, as you can see, Switzerland has had phenomenal success, and it's just been really since that early, we were there mid-90s, but they only started that system about early 90s. And so it's such an infinitesimal number of players really compared to Canada. And yet, because of the high level of coaching, you've got a very, very competitive national team and a very competitive Swiss league.
Gentleman in the white shirt at the back, I think you had a question?
No.
No? There's someone in the back? No?
We'll just take one more.
Yeah.
I've seen firsthand, it's the coaching. If the coaching is subpar, all your numbers are not, you might as well flush them down the toilet. Because I've seen it both in hockey and in baseball. And bad coaching will take the kid away from the sport, if the kid, and especially if the kid has a sport. And I see it a little bit more firsthand. My kid's a professional golfer. And, if you asked what his best sport was, it was hockey. But look where he's at. It's all because it was bad coaching.
Did you
you want to make a final comment, 32?
And just to get back to this coaching issue, so yeah, we did see some qualitative, more anecdotal story of like the loss of quality coaches in rural or small towns, because some of those people are actually moving to other provinces for work. Let's say from Northern Ontario to Alberta for work, which is sort of reflective of the so-called de-industrialization of small towns. Big sawmill company leaving for China, or steel company leaving for other developing nations. So what you mentioned about this, the importance of coaching, probably is one story of what we're finding in our statistics.
I just think it's the most important, because if you got a bad coach and you got a kid with talent, he's done.
That's right, exactly. It's a support system that exists in these communities, including good coaching, parents, friends, everything. Yep.
So, where's the book on good coaching?
That's usually the argument.
Yeah, but if you're saying that, it's, all you gotta do is get a good coach. All right, so let's find a good coach. Let's get. I mean, I don't think it's that easy, because what one coach can do, another, can't deliver. I mean, I mentioned I'm from St. Mike's. I remember walking the arena one day, and there were 3 people on the ice. And one of them was Eric Lindros, one of them was Brett Lindros, and the other guy was a coach named Dan Cameron. A bit of a nut bar, but I think he was teaching Eric and Brett how to be, let's say, obnoxious on the ice. One of his things there, just go into a corner, but they also had, well, at least Eric had the talent to take it to a different level. So to say that, you get good and bad coaching. So you mean to say, so a coach goes out and says, let me see how I can be bad today, or what I can't teach this guy is going to make him. I think everybody goes out there with pretty good intentions, but it doesn't work on everybody. I think bottom line, somebody mentioned earlier, you got the talent, you're going to make it. I don't care if you're living in big town, small town, whatever, because you got guys from small towns where the players make it. How come everybody doesn't make it? How come in families? How come Wayne Gretzky's so great and Keith was doing commercials for 7-Up? I mean,
155 pounds and no speed.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you very much, Lisa.